There we go. So we're going to get started. Welcome. My name is Rob Hayes. Some of you may know me already. I am the coordinator of journalism, media, and professional writing at the college. And welcome, everybody. This presentation is sponsored by the Commuter, which is Northampton's student news organization. And we typically have a presentation every fall around this time. And we're very happy to be able to have it again this year through the wonders of Zoom technology. Typically, we'd have had this on campus, on our main campus, midday period. So we're going to continue to have it the midday period, which is 11 to 12:15. So hopefully we'll have another presentation sometime in our lifetime, actually on campus. But stay tuned. We know how that works right now with the coronavirus. Our presenter, our speaker, is a veteran journalist and political polling expert, David Morris. David has been a journalist for more than 40 years, most of it in the Washington, D.C. Area, actually in Washington, D.C. He has been with he was with the Associated Press for more than 13 years in its various bureaus. Harrisburg, where he uncovered corruption in Sacramento, California, and then later in Washington, D.C. And when David went to Washington, D.C., he didn't stay put with the Associated Press. He's gone on to for 30 months, he was the chief White House correspondent, national political writer for Bloomberg News, and he has also had some time spent at the National Journal's Congress Daily, which is, I believe, is a news service. Is that right, David?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and where he was managing editor and then executive editor, and then he wrapped up his Washington years as the deputy managing editor of the Kiplinger Letter. Say Kiplinger 10 times real fast. Try that. Go ahead. No, don't do that. But it's a mouthful. Anyways, here's the key. Along the way, David started studying polling at the University of Michigan and its survey research program. And he took his newly acquired skills and applied them as the lead election race caller and trainer for the Associated Press, which started using exit polling nationwide in 1994. So it's been almost, do the math, about 20 years plus in polling. Now here's a final little fact about Dave. He spends most of his time these days writing music and writing about music, and he just won a national award last year, International Journalist of the Year from the International Bluegrass Association. So any of you guys are into bluegrass, Dave's your guy.
Both of you.
Well, both of you. As far as what we're going to get into today, talking about political polling, the national election, and the various repertoire of skills that journalists brings to the table besides just polling, I should note that Dave is continuing his 18-year association with ABC News, where he will be analyzing exit polls on election night. So if you tune into ABC on election night, you may see David smiling or scowling or whatever face talking about the election and the polling. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David and let you take it away.
Good morning. Thank you, Rob and Kim, for inviting me, and to all of you for showing up. If you're a student in Kim's class, please take note, there will be homework. And if you're in Rob's class, don't worry about that midnight deadline. I should be done before then. I wanted to take a few minutes to tell you a few relevant things about myself. First, the very first story I ever wrote, I use the word story loosely, was based on a poll. I was in 6th grade, writing for a class paper, which was actually a mimeographed sheet. I'm guessing many of you have no idea what a mimeograph machine is. Don't worry about it. The poll asked which of 2 players on the high school basketball team was better. Big, important stuff in a school district known for football. Second, the very first poll I ever supervised for a real newspaper, the weekend before an election, showed the wrong winner. More on that later. Finally, I'm allergic to math. I mean, seriously. In my last semester at Penn State, I needed to take a math elective to graduate. I was already working on the speech to my parents about why I would need to go an extra semester after flunking math. That's how bad I was. But I found my salvation in the title of a math book at the student bookstore. When I saw it, I knew that was the course for me. The title of the book was Math for Poets. I highly recommend it. With that in mind, and my qualifications dubiously established, let's get into it. I'm going to ask for your participation in this little exercise here. If I said I was going to take a national poll of 1,000 people and use it to characterize this presidential race, 2020, who among you would be confident that I could tell a reasonably accurate tale of the status of that campaign based on 1,000 interviews? Show of hands. 1,000 people. Lots of skeptics. Who would not be confident? Who thinks that's not enough? Okay. And who doesn't know? So to the knows and the don't knows, let me ask you this. When you taste a pot of soup, do you have to eat the whole thing to figure out if it needs more salt? If the doctor orders a blood test, does she have to take all your blood to figure out what's wrong? If she did, I could tell you what was wrong. Similarly, you don't need, if it's done right, you don't need more than 1,000 people to get a pretty good handle on the national status of an election. Similarly, you don't need more than 850 or 1,000 people to get a read on a particular state race. Generally, there are good polls and there are not good polls, not so good polls. They all usually come in around the same 1,000 questions, 1,000 interviews. But there are some things to look for. And my goal today is to give you 5 things to look for, 5 ways to tell the good polls from the bad polls. Number 1, the first thing is who was polled. In political polls, there are 3 general potential audiences. One is voting age Americans. Another is registered voters. And the third is likely voters. Polls of voting age people aren't very helpful. Just if you see them, just don't pay any attention to them. The reason is half the people you interviewed aren't registered, won't register, and won't vote. So their opinions in a political survey are irrelevant. Polls of registered voters eliminate some of that noise, but many who are registered still won't vote. Also, keep in mind that a poll of registered voters is always going to be a little more biased in favor of the Democratic candidate than the Republican. And the simple reason is there are more registered Democrats in the United States than registered Republicans. So likely voters is the way to go. And the best polls at this point within a month of the contest are absolutely the ones that you should be looking at. But here's the rub: identifying likely voters is more art than science. Some pollsters simply ask if you're likely to vote, and there's incredible social pressure to say yes. So that's not the best barometer. Others use the results of 4 or 5 separate questions to determine who qualifies as a likely voter and who doesn't. Much better, but still some guesswork. The second thing you want to look for is how the sample was selected. Say we're looking at a poll of registered voters. In theory, every registered voter in America should have an equal chance of being selected to participate in your poll. Not as hard as it sounds. That's why pollsters use random number charts to generate the phone numbers that they'll dial. If you have an unlisted phone number and a pollster gets a hold of you, you might be wondering, wow, where did they get my number? It was totally by accident. The random number generator spit out your phone number, and there you go. So, you know, that's as close as we can come as pollsters to giving everyone a relatively equal chance of being selected. The element of randomness, we're speaking today, Dave, helps assure you don't end up with a lopsided number of, younger people, a lopsided number of Republicans, a lopsided number of college graduates, any demographic characteristic that is out of whack with the general norm is going to skew your results. Age is a good one. A poll that underestimates younger voters and oversamples middle-aged voters is going to have quite different results than polls that come closer to the mark. The same with gender. There's a huge gender gap right now between Biden and Trump. More women than men tend to favor Biden, and it's a pretty wide margin, and it seems to be getting wider by the poll. So it's important to get that male-female ratio correct, or your poll is going to be off, and maybe far off the mark. Now, here are things that, those are sort of obvious. Here are some less obvious ways to judge whether polls are good or not. First is question wording. I can write a question to preordain just about any outcome. In the best polls, the questions are balanced. So a good poll wouldn't ask, will you vote for President Trump, the incumbent, to serve a second term? Rather, it would ask, if the election for president were held today, would you vote for Donald Trump, Joe Biden, another candidate, or would you not vote? And the interviewers would rotate the names so that in our case, Trump was first. In a good poll, Trump and Biden are going to be split equally. In some cases, half the cases they'll ask about Biden first. In half the cases they'll ask about Trump first. There's a reason this is important, but I'm not going to get into it right now, but I can explain it later during the Q&A if anyone is interested. The other thing is question order. If I ask a series of negative questions about a candidate before I ask who you're going to vote for, the vote for the candidate who all the questions were directed at is going to be, his numbers are going to be depressed, or her numbers. And if I ask a series of positive questions first, the reverse, their numbers will be higher than they might ordinarily be. And the final yardstick, when was the poll conducted? Polls taken before the first presidential debate showed Biden with less of an advantage than he has in polls taken afterward. The same with polls taken before Trump tested positive and was hospitalized for the virus, and after. The big unknown is whether those changes will stick. News events have a measurable, though not often permanent, effect on public opinion. That's another way of saying people have short attention spans. Here's an example from outside the realm of election politics. In 1999, when I supervised a weekly survey on national issues for the AP, we had a poll in the field about gun control. Midway through the polling period, day 3 of a 6-day survey, there was a major school shooting in Colorado. I immediately suspended polling and came back to it later in the week. So here's the deal. There was a big swing toward tougher gun laws in the second half of the poll, the portion conducted after the shooting, than there was in the days before. And when I went back and asked the same questions a month later, separate poll, a month later, the numbers reverted almost identically to the pre-shooting numbers. The news was no longer fresh, and remember what I said about short memories. One more note about when polls are conducted, and this is relevant to elections. The further away from the election, the less meaningful the results. I put much more faith in a poll taken today than I would in a poll taken 2 months ago, or even a month ago, or even 2 weeks ago. The closer you get, the better. The reason is people change their minds. Some candidates stumble, others soar, and sometimes, as we saw in the gun poll, events overtake the issues, overtake the opinion. Also, the closer to the election that polling ends, the higher the likelihood that the poll will come close to the actual results. That ill-fated poll that started my career, we stopped polling on Saturday, but we were also in the middle of a brutal newspaper war. And we were viewed as the Republican newspaper in the Wyoming Valley. So we probably had too few Democratic responses in our sample. To be honest, I didn't know then what I know now about how to address that problem. We reported that the Republican candidate was ahead and would likely win. He wasn't, and he didn't. Years later, when I was asked to lead the Associated Press's national entry into exit polling, I assumed they didn't know about that little episode, and I wasn't about to tell them. But the AP did send me off to the University of Michigan, as Rob alluded earlier. So I was able to learn from my mistakes and make a career out of numbers. So now you know what to look for, and you're wondering, where do I look? How do I find this out? Well, like anything, it takes work. But the best polls and the best pollsters are transparent, and their methodology statements are readily available online. They spell out the number of interviews, whether they were likely among likely or registered voters, margin of error, and all sorts of other details that can help you make up your minds. The best also make their questionnaires available, so you can make judgments about the wording of questions and the order the questions were asked. Like I said, a lot of work. There is, however, a shortcut. If you haven't learned this yet, you'll learn it soon enough. There's always a shortcut. Some news organizations do the heavy lifting for you. ABC's polling unit, for instance, rates pollsters as airworthy or not airworthy. So if ABC News writes or mentions a particular poll or a particular pollster, you can be confident that pollster has passed ABC's fairly stringent review. Nate Silver at the ABC affiliated 538, it's number 5, number 3, number 8.com, goes a step further and gives every poll and pollster a letter grade. So if you Look at polls that only get A and A+ ratings and ignore those that get lower failing grades. You'll be ahead of the game. Silver and others also note if pollsters have ties to either party. Both parties poll, and they poll a lot. He and I tend to downplay partisan polls. Actually, he tends to downplay them. I ignore them. Remember how I said I could preordain the answers to questions through question wording and question order? Many party pollsters do this, and they don't release the full questionnaires or the wording of individual questions. So you have no idea whether they're doing it or not. I always assume in a partisan poll that they do, because somebody's paying them for a poll, and they're not going to keep paying them for polls that show answers that they don't like. It's that simple. I want to get into the weeds for just a few minutes. I see some people shaking their heads like, dude, you've been in the weeds already. Come on. Every poll has a margin of error and what we call a confidence interval. For that poll we talked about of 1,000 people, the margin of error is usually in the range of plus or minus 3 percentage points. And most have a confidence level or a confidence interval of 95%. Here's what that means. If we took the same poll at the same time 100 times, 95 of the polls would have a result within that margin of error, plus or minus 3 points of whatever our poll showed. So a 3-point lead for one candidate might actually be a 3-point lead for the other candidate. Or it could be an even bigger lead, a 6-point lead for the candidate that we showed up 3. All depends on which way the error breaks. And 5 times out of 100, that's the 5 outside of the 95, 5 times out of 100, you can expect the results to be outside of those ranges. Before my monitor failed, I had a very nice representation of a bell curve, but you all know what a bell curve looks like. If we drew our poll results from those 100 polls as a bell curve, almost every result would be in the main body of the bell in the very beginning of the slope. And 2.5 percentage points would be on each side would be the very narrow tails of possibilities. So we're out of the weeds now. So what went wrong in 2016? Why did what seemed to be a near certain victory for Hillary Clinton turn into a surprising win for Donald Trump? Here comes a nuanced answer. First, the national polls were actually pretty accurate. In the days before the election, most of them showed Clinton with a lead of 3 to 5 percentage points. And she won the popular vote by a little over 3 points, well within the margin of error. But presidential races, as you probably know, unlike any other, are decided by electoral votes on a state-by-state basis. And some state polls, frankly, were not accurate. Not as accurate as the national numbers, at least. Some of the pollsters stopped polling too soon. Remember what I said about events taking place that can change people's minds. If they didn't poll over the weekend before the election, they missed a lot of movement toward Mr. Trump. In some cases, they didn't poll third-party voters. And while they were generally small numbers in a close race, small numbers in the direction of a third-party candidate, taking them away from one particular major party candidate can make a difference, and it did make a difference. And in some cases, political decisions played a part. If Clinton's campaign hadn't coasted had made maybe one more trip to Pennsylvania and or Michigan, perhaps we'd be covering her bid for a second term and giving an entirely different set of remarks to you. At the time, I was deputy managing editor of the Kiplinger Letter. I don't have any trouble saying that, Rob. I don't know.
You're more practiced at that.
Yes. The Friday before the election, which digital subscribers saw Friday night and mail subscribers received on the Monday, day before the election, I wrote on our front page that it was Clinton's race to lose. That Trump had a path to victory, but it would require him to run the table of toss-up states and pick off a couple of states where Clinton held a lead, albeit a narrow lead. That was his only chance. As I wrote, it would take the perfect storm for Trump to win. And that's precisely what happened. The surprise was nearly universal. It wasn't just me. It's been widely reported that Trump and his closest advisors expected to lose. So much so that they hadn't really paid much attention to the transition from President Obama to President Trump, which most candidates start in the summer before the election so that they're ready to go if they win. Didn't even start it. And Clinton and her staff had written the victory speech, but not a concession speech. Even Bill O'Reilly, then hosting a political commentary show on Fox News, was caught short. The Sunday before Election Day, I appeared on his show. I stuck to what I'd written in the Kiplinger Letter. After the show, O'Reilly popped into the green room, and I guess he thought he was going to get me to admit that I had given propaganda on the air. He asked me what I really thought. I repeated exactly what I said in my piece because that's really what I thought. I remember very clearly. He shook his. I said Clinton could win by as little as 3 electoral votes, and that it was possible, that, but not likely, that Trump could have this perfect storm and win. But that I didn't think that would happen. O'Reilly, a longtime conservative cheerleader who started his broadcasting career right down the road from all of you folks in Wilkes-Barre, shook his head. He was a weatherman, by the way, then. Shook his head, said, "Nope, she's going to win. She's going to win big." And he walked away. I just hope his weather forecasts were more accurate than his political forecast. So is there reason to believe that this year's polls will be any different? My qualified answer is yes. 4 years ago, Clinton wasn't at or above 50% in any national polls. Biden is in some this year, and actually in a growing number this year as we get closer to the election. Her negative approval ratings, I guess they would be called disapproval ratings, wouldn't they? Her disapproval ratings were well below Biden's numbers. And Trump's vote percentage hasn't budged from the low 40s all year. That's his base. He's not going anywhere outside his base so far. But I'm not ready to count any chickens. I learned that in 2016. There's still more than a month to go. When I covered Pennsylvania politics in Harrisburg, Dick Thornburg used to tell me, a month is a lifetime in politics. And he's right. We don't know how President Trump's illness will play out. We don't know if Biden will stay healthy or whether he'll make a major gaffe or misstatement. There's a long history of those in his 40 years of campaigns. So it's not a crazy thing to ponder. In sum, we don't know what we don't know. And if 2020 has taught us anything, it's probably not done saying, hold my beer. So ask me again on November 1st. I have to warn you, my answer still might be vague. I want to shift attention a bit to exit polls. They measure how people actually voted and are used to help project the winners before all the votes are counted. I look for this to be the most challenging year yet in exit polls, and they've all been challenging to a degree. It's a bit of working without a net, calling a race, sometimes before any votes are counted or any vote counts are released based on your polls. We do that. We've done that. We might be a little more reluctant this year based on some reasons that I'll get into. First of all, many more thousands of ballots are likely to be cast during early voting periods and through mail-in voting this year. Some of those votes will be captured in the telephone polls that the networks have added to supplement the election day exit polls, but some of them won't be, putting extra burdens on already super cautious race callers. We know from ballot request information provided by some states that many more Democrats and independents have requested absentee or mail-in ballots than Republicans. But what we don't know is how many of them will actually complete and return those ballots and who they'll vote for. Just because you have a Democrat, just because you're a Democrat requesting a ballot doesn't mean you'll vote for the Democratic candidate. So this could happen right there in Pennsylvania, a tipping point state with the potential to get one candidate above the 270 electoral votes needed to win. Mr. Trump could finish election night with a big lead in the election day polls, in the election day vote. He might even declare himself the winner. And if he does that, don't be surprised if Fox News goes along. But what if, when the count of mail-in and absentee votes is completed, the next day, 2 days later, the following week, whenever, if Biden comes out ahead, wins Pennsylvania, and wins the election, it could get ugly. It could get really ugly. Of course, if Biden has a big lead in the election day vote in Pennsylvania, that takes some of the pressure off. It's likely only to grow when those mail-in votes are counted. So maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to call Pennsylvania and call the national election on November 3rd or in the wee hours of November 4th, as is often the case. Whatever the outcome, the focus will be predominantly on the media. If I turn around right now, you can see a big target on my back. And it gets bigger as the election gets closer. The reason is, journalists are largely responsible for the results that you hear on election day. At the federal level, there's no single agency in charge of the vote count. Let that sink in a bit. 50 states, 50 sets of rules, and nobody has oversight of the overall count. Some states are good at reporting their official numbers quickly. They get them from each county has an election board. Each county reports them to the state secretary of state or state elections officer. And that's how the state gets their numbers. But news organizations don't wait. We post reporters in many of the major polling area, election areas, the biggest counties, and we use phone banks to contact folks in other election boards so that we can get the count as quickly, or perhaps, and usually more quickly, than the states. So the numbers from journalists become the de facto results until states certify their official vote, and that's often days or sometimes weeks later. So be ready for partisan attacks, for cries of fake news, for court challenges. Be prepared for anything. I'd like to conclude, don't clap yet. I'd like to conclude by getting philosophical for a minute. journalism is vastly different than it was when I started. Back when most of your parents were your age or younger. Back when some of them weren't even born yet. But it's still a noble calling. Real journalists are still on the side of truth, no matter which side of the political landscape that truth falls on. And polls, despite all the shortcomings that I've pointed out, are still useful and valuable tools to help get at that truth. Consume them wisely. You now have a head start on how to do that. Years ago, I found this pin, and I still wear it regularly. It says, write hard, die free. Write hard, die free. Those are powerful words to live by, and I commend them to you. Thanks for staying awake, and I'm happy to take your questions. There are no questions that I won't answer. Fire away.
You can unmute yourself to ask your question.
I have a question.
Sure.
So a poll came out this morning from CNN that had Biden up 16 points, and some of the more progressive pundits that I follow seemed really shocked by that. Is that poll any reason to believe that Biden has a sure path to victory? What's going on with that poll?
Well, for a couple of things, and that's a great question, and I was hoping someone would ask about that very poll. First of all, after 2016, I don't think any number in a poll would lead me to believe that Biden has a sure path to victory. He's got it would suggest he has a clearer path to victory. Here's the thing about that poll. It's the newest poll out there. Remember margin of error, remember confidence intervals, and remember the little tails way out there on the end of the bell curve, the outliers. It's possible that the CNN poll is an outlier, that those numbers are wildly overstated, and that Biden's lead is, maybe in the ballpark of 7, 8, 9 points, which is much closer to what other polls have shown. But it's also possible, as the newest poll out there, it's also possible that CNN has caught the wave at just the right time, and that after COVID and after the debate and after everything else that's happened in the last few days, that there is very real movement like that toward Biden. We'll know, and if we'll know, we'll have a much better idea, at least in a few days, because if other polls start coming in showing that big bump up, then I think we can start thinking CNN caught the wave at just the right moment, and they were the first to get out there with it. If other polls show the same old, 7, 8, 9, 10-point leads for Biden that some of the other polls have shown, then I think we can feel certain that, a little more certain at least, that the CNN poll was an outlier and that it was one of those outside of the 95% confidence level. We just don't know enough based on one poll. A good rule of thumb, by the way, to factor in without trying to figure out whether this is an outlier or if it's the catching the wave at the right time. A good rule of thumb is to average recent polls. Real Clear Politics, realclearpolitics.com does this every day. Every time a new poll comes out, they report it, they report the details, and they factor it into their poll, what they call their poll of polls. So my guess is that once CNN is factored in, I haven't looked at Real Clear Politics today. My guess is once it's factored in, it might bump the average up, Biden's average up a half point or so, since most other polls are much lower than that. But again, if you're just looking at if you look at the next CNN poll, if you look at the next ABC News Washington Post poll, or the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, any good reliable poll, if you're starting to see those numbers, then I think CNN was in the field at just the right time, and it's not an outlier. It's pretty real.
Thank you.
Do we have another question for David?
You have to, because I get paid for the next half hour. I'm just going to have to make things up.
Yeah, just unmute yourself if you have a question to ask. We're not going to use the chat function.
Yeah, I have a question. So out of curiosity, I have a background in survey methodologies, or at least a small background in survey methodologies. So how do you stack in stuff like, let's say, YouGov, where in my end experience, we tend to prefer having everyone lay out their entire methodology and here's how we're actually structuring it, where YouGov says, well, no, this is all proprietary, we're hiding it. Does that bring in a level of distrust to what they're doing?
It actually does. The American Association of Public Opinion Research, which I used to be a member of, but I decided to join the Bluegrass Association instead. They actually encourage openness and transparency. So yeah, somebody that says it's proprietary, I say, see you later. You just don't know you just don't know if they're cutting corners and what corners they're cutting if they are.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
Other question?
Come on, I gave you all a question to ask me later. Anybody remember it? Because I don't.
David, I'll ask you one question. Given the Electoral College and it's I don't say it's the wild card factor, but it certainly can. Well, it can cause an outcome that would not be projected from the overall numbers, like the popular vote. Does this mean really we should be looking more closely, or maybe we are, but looking far more closely at the individual states rather than a global picture of the country? Because it seems like, it can come down to a very narrow vote in a handful of states that can determine the outcome, which might not have been anticipated.
Absolutely. There are a fair number of polls being done in the true toss-up states. I mean, look, there's no reason to waste your money conducting a state poll in South Dakota. Trump is going to win, and Trump is going to win big. But in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, Ohio, Iowa, Arizona, Florida, Texas, there are a lot of state polls being conducted, and we try to pay attention to all of them. National polls are meaningless, as you pointed out, in the overall who's going to win the election, but they're important for demographic reasons. They're important to show that the big picture trends of who had a successful debate and who didn't, because all of those things eventually drive the numbers when you get down to state polls. And secondly, there is sort of a rough yardstick that you can use. George Bush lost the popular vote and won the electoral vote with a little help from the Supreme Court. And then, of course, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and lost the electoral vote. In both cases, those wins in the Democratic wins in the popular vote were fairly narrow, a point and a half or so for Gore, if I remember correctly. I might be a little off there, and roughly 3 points for Hillary Clinton. And there have been some, Nate Silver has done a good job, for instance, plotting out and trying to analyze where in the popular vote does a lead translate to an irreversible electoral college win for a candidate. And it seems to be, you start getting safe around at 3 points, as we've seen, anything can happen. When you start getting to like 4.5, 5 points, it's a little more likely that the person with that 4.5, 5 point national lead will survive the electoral college count. And above that, it seems to become pretty automatic that there's, you know, win the electoral vote, win the popular vote by, you know, 6 or 7 points, and you're the president. So not entirely helpful figuring out winners of the electoral college, but still useful. Now, when we do exit polls, we do by individual states. We take a national survey we take them all into our national exit poll for analysis of, you know, the break between men and women, between younger, older voters, how independents voted, et cetera. But to determine, to call the race, we actually look at polls specific to that state. So the question that I told someone that I would explain if they asked me during the question and answer was why it's important to rotate names when you ask a polling question. Anybody have a thought on why we should do that?
Would it be kind of similar to what you said about if you ask a bunch of like negative questions about a particular person and then you want to ask, like you mentioned earlier, if you mentioned repetitive questions
Right.
that are negatively directed towards one candidate, and then you ask a positive question about the other candidate, won't it impact the individual answering the question? Wouldn't it impact like the way that they approach the question?
That's a great answer, and it does, just a little bit differently than you posited. Going back to, you know, memories, there are many sociological studies that show in a list of 2, people tend to remember the first name that they hear and not the second. Now it's a little bit, so if you're taking a poll over the phone, you're hearing someone read you the question, Donald Trump, okay, and you sort of, even though there's only 2 names, you tend to pick the first one. Interestingly, in a longer list, if it's in the primary and there are 8 Democrats running for the presidential nomination, and you're asked the question and they name all 8, you're more likely to name the person that was named last, because that's the one that's clearest in your mind. They're called, remembering the first name is called primacy effect. And then on the longer list, you have the last thing you hear is the one you remember, because 8 names ago was a long time, and you're on the phone and your kid is calling for your attention and the dog is throwing up on the rug and your attention is scattered. I don't have a kid, but I've heard about them. I do have a dog that throws up on the rug. I know all about that. What else do we got?
Hi, David.
Go ahead.
I was wondering if you were following any of the Senate races, and in particular with North Carolina and the sort of scandal that's come out with, I believe it's Cunningham, and I was wondering what your thoughts on it were.
Sure. We do exit polling on presidential. We do exit polling on all the national races, so president and Senate. We don't do exit polling on individual House races. There's too many of them, although we have a team at ABC News that follows the vote and projects winners from that. In the North Carolina race, this is the perfect example of late breaking news. For those of you who don't know, Cunningham, the Democrat, was leading Tillis, the incumbent Republican, pretty handily. And Tillis came down in this same batch of news accounts in which Mr. and Mrs. Trump and many others tested positive. So did Tillis, who was at that famous now famous Supreme Court rollout, where I think we're now up to 11 or 12 people who have tested positive. And it was going to be interesting to see how that affected the race. And then Cunningham was acknowledged that he had been in a sexting relationship with someone other than his wife. And so now we have a new, we have a whole new issue that can weigh on the polls. My guess is, and it's just a guess at this point, we've only seen one poll, and it hasn't made a lot of difference. And my guess is that it won't make a lot of difference. It might narrow the race by a point or two. I don't think it's going to change the outcome of the race. Ever since Bill Clinton said it depends on what the definition of is, we've been pretty immune to news of a sexual nature changing things. There are exceptions, and interestingly, one of those exceptions is in North Carolina, and that was when John Edwards, his affair was disclosed, and it drove him from the presidential race. That one had, I would argue, I'm not arguing for or against any of that, but I would argue that in the Edwards case, that situation was complicated by the fact that his wife was dying of cancer at the time. So my guess is it'll have very little impact, and if it does, we'll know very quickly. We'll know in the next few days, because you can bet there are pollsters in North Carolina beating the bushes out there right now and asking that very question.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I have a two-part question, if I can remember it. Every 4 years, the debate over popular vote versus electoral college comes up, and people debate, of course, depending what side you're on, who won or lost. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, this year, of course, I think it's been brought home, as you mentioned, that this is a state-by-state deal, the election, national election. And this year especially, it's proven how just incredibly messy it is. And a lot of people just I think, have not realized this, that it's not only state by state, but it's often county by county and how things are done. Point of fact, of course, the mail-in ballot situation in Pennsylvania, either fortunately or otherwise, of course, launched a mail-in voting initiative before COVID happened. I guess that was good, but it hasn't really been tested in the terms of a national election yet. So, it's going to be one of the states where, already is one of the states where there are lawsuits, et cetera. Anyway, point of that question is, can you see any movement towards some kind of a national election system? Or are we so state by state oriented that, we're going to keep up with this kind of mess that we have in terms of, who does what, how it's done. Incredibly difficult in this age of, global communications and social media for people to keep it all straight. I just see a lot of confusion out there.
I think there are two things that are carved in stone and will not change, at least in our lifetimes. And I know some of you have very long lives ahead of you, but I'm still saying in our lifetimes. One is, we will not have a national election system. The states cling to that power, and it's become institutionalized. The second thing is, we will not move away from the Electoral College. It would take a constitutional amendment to change that. And in this particular political environment, the odds of anything of that nature to a constitutional amendment requires ratification by 2/3 of the states, and it requires supermajority approval in the House and the Senate. So nothing, it's impossible to get post office namings through the split Senate right now. I would be willing to say that, and I'm not going to be here to know if I was right or wrong, so it's easy for me to say this, but I would be willing to say that we will not see another constitutional amendment of any sort in the next 75 to 100 years. The good news, if you are a Democrat or you support Democratic candidates, is we may be on the cusp of a swing. Right now, the Electoral College favors Republicans. And the reason is, while most big states, electoral votes are determined based on the number of representatives you have in Congress plus your 2 senators. So huge states like California, New York, Florida, Texas, they all get a big number of electoral votes. And the fewest you can get, and a lot of states, smaller states have this, is 3. 1 for your rep in Congress and 2 for your senators. Democrats do very well year after year in many of the big states. And Republicans win a couple of the big states and just about everything else. So, the Electoral College advantage in recent years and this year is on the Republican side. But we're seeing a greater number of Hispanic voters in Texas and in Arizona. We're seeing a growing number of Hispanic voters in Florida. And it's not outside the realm of possibility that as more of those Hispanics become registered voters, and in Texas and Arizona especially, they tend to register as Democrats, less so in Florida. But you could get to a point where Texas and or Arizona both become reliably blue states, that is, support Democrats. And if that's the case, along with the big states that they always win, New York, California, et cetera, that could give Democrats the Electoral College advantage down the road. And you will hear Republicans crying out to change the system the way Democrats are now. So it's cyclical, it goes and comes, and but it's here to stay.
David, following up on that matter, as far as electoral colleges, you see any chance that we might get away from the winner take all in a state with the electoral college votes, and it'd be more proportional to the actual popular vote within the state, how many electoral, votes you get?
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a greater chance of that happening than getting rid of the Electoral College. Or getting a federal election commission to take control of the vote count. But still, in large part, it's going to depend on who controls the state legislatures and who controls the governor's seat in a particular state. I'd say there's less than a 50% chance of it happening in the next 10 years, but it could happen down the road. We're used to this in primary elections. It's getting less and less. The division is getting less and less clear, but in recent years, Democrats awarded delegates to their primary candidates proportionally to their vote. And Republicans awarded them winner take all. There's still some winner take all states, but more and more you're seeing the proportional awarding of delegates, but that's primary, not general.
I have one last question if we still have time.
Sure, David.
So you were talking early on about sort of the reliability of polling. And there's like certain polls that you should trust, certain polls you should just ignore. But I note in a lot of assessments of national polling, Rasmussen reports are frequently included, and they tend to trend towards conservative, so whatever that may mean. But more the meta question of why is that included on a regular basis? Is it supposed to reflect a certain mindset or question mark?
Interestingly, when I was the national political writer for Bloomberg, I enacted a ban. We were prohibited from using Rasmussen polls. Some people include them because they include everything, and their view is the more you include, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly on both sides, and the good stuff in the middle, the closer you're going to get to, you know, telling the full story. I have a couple of issues with Rasmussen. Number one is, if you look, you know, people say, well, they were the most accurate pollster in 2016. Well, yeah, they were, if you ignored a lot of the work that they did. They got one number right, and it was the last one, and they got a lot wrong before that. I don't know how they got that last number because their methodology isn't as fully disclosed as others. My other major problem, though, with Rasmussen is the way they conduct their polls. They don't use live callers. I don't take a random number and start dialing the phone and get you on the phone to ask you the questions, David. I send you, there's one of two things that happen. One is it's internet based. You get an email and you know, and you can go to this link and take the poll yourself. I have no idea whether you filled it out, whether, you know, your girlfriend filled it out, your dog, your neighbor, your mom, whatever. So I can't control my sample because I can't control who's taking the result. The other one is a lot of pollsters that I don't trust, like Survey USA, they get a local TV personality to record the call, and they dial. You pick up the phone, and you hear, you know, this is Joe Blow from WNEP TV, blah, 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 reading the questions. And again, you answer the phone. If I'm looking to talk to, you know, a male voter in the household, and I'm looking to talk particularly to you because you're who was selected in the sample, I don't know that the person pressing the buttons on the other end of the phone is you. Yeah, I don't know if it's male or female. There's a lot of trust in those answers, and they're very easy to manipulate. So I'm a stickler for you know, for live caller interviews. We are factoring more and more non-live interviews into pre-election polls, not into exit polls. Exit polls. The beauty of exit polls is I'm face to face with you. You come out of the polling. You come out of a particular poll where I happen to be stationed, and my job is to interview every seventh voter, say, and you're number 7. I'm face to face with you. So it's a little harder to it's a little harder to give squishy answers and to hide the fact that, you know, if you're 22 and you're claiming to be, you know, 65 plus, you know, Botox is great, but it's not that great.
By the way, we have another 9 minutes, folks. So if you have some more questions you really want to ask, you can ask them now.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Do you see the same issues that you just brought up with phone call, polling, and whatnot being an issue with the upcoming mail-in voting?
Well, it's going to be a challenge because if, let's say that in a particular state, just to make the math easy, because I'm allergic to math, remember, if 50% of the voters vote in person on election day and 50% either vote early or by mail, either absentee or regular mail-in voting, then me, as I stand at a polling spot and interview every seventh or eighth person or whatever my instructions are that day, I'm going to miss 50% of the voters. We account for that by doing telephone polls of when we ask people if they've already voted. We ask people if they've applied for absentee ballots or by mail ballots. We ask if they've already voted either by mail or early in person, which some states allow, and then ask their preferences. We ask a series of questions to figure out if they haven't already voted, to figure out if they will in time to have their vote counted. And then we blend in the phone polls with the actual exit day, election day exit polls. And they're, in an ideal world, we'd be able to ask everybody face to face coming out of the polling station, but that world has passed and we'll never get back to that. So this is the next best thing. It makes it makes calling races a little more challenging than it used to be, because again, I can ask you 3 different times if you expect to cast your ballot, and if you don't, you're still counted in the poll because you said you were going to. So, I think you'll see more and more will come to rely on at least some actual vote being counted before winners are declared.
I haven't been alive for many elections, but when it comes to this year's election, I know the Hillary and Trump election was a pretty obviously big deal. But in terms of this year's election, when it comes to third-party votes or no voting at all, do you think this year it's gonna like skyrocket as opposed to prior elections?
I think it won't, and here's why. We've had a few elections in my lifetime where third-party candidates got enough votes to matter. They've not won in my memory. You have to go back into the very beginnings of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century to find any times that a third-party candidate has won a state. Hasn't happened in modern times. It has thrown elections. I think Ross Perot took enough votes away from George H.W. Bush to allow Clinton to become president. An argument can be made. I'm not quite sure I believe it, but I haven't looked at it in great detail. An argument could be made that Ralph Nader received enough support, took enough support away from Al Gore in Florida in 2000 to change the outcome of that race. And, third parties will continue to be, sort of they're not going to be the main course. They're a condiment or maybe a tasty little piece, a tasty little bite of dessert, but they don't, it's very hard for third-party candidates to qualify for the ballot on all 50 states. The rules were written by the parties in power, and they made it a particularly steep climb. third parties to get involved. You'll see fights all over social media about, I'm voting for a third party candidate this year. Don't do that. It's a vote for Trump, or don't do that. It's just like voting for Biden. The real reality is it depends on where you live. If you want to vote for a third party candidate and you live in California, you're not going to affect anything because, the Democratic candidate is going to win that state in a landslide. But if you're voting for a third party candidate in, Pennsylvania in 2016, Trump won the state by, actually, I don't remember, but he won Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin by a combined total of 77,000 votes, which isn't a lot. So if you live in a state where the race is going to be very close, voting for a third party could actually be considered as a vote for one of the candidates, the candidate that didn't get that support taken away from him. So if you were inclined to vote for Trump, generally speaking, and then ended up voting for a third party candidate, that could be argued in a close state to be a vote for Biden. But, I think the most important thing is for people to vote, no matter how they vote.
Thank you so much.
Sure thing.
One more quick question.
Come on, Kim, you can do it.
Who's your favorite band?
Say that again.
Your favorite band or musician?
Whew. Do you mean bluegrass or any band?
Your choice.
My favorite band in the world was Uncle Tupelo, which broke up in the 1990s and became Son Volt and Wilco. My favorite bluegrass band is the latest band to record one of my songs. Hopefully
That's great.
Hopefully that changes frequently. You guys have been great. This is fun. And it gave me an excuse to actually put real clothes on for the first time in about 6 months. So.
Yeah, I got kind of tired of wearing pajama bottoms myself, Well, David, thank you very much for being here today, joining with us to talk about the polling, the election, well, to be honest, some of the institutional barriers to prevent third parties becoming viable because of those in power setting the rules, and you can't break the rules very easily. And that's another subject entirely, perhaps, but it is a sobering thought that we're kind of stuck with two choices usually. And if you go for a third choice, you might actually lose that person that you did want to win out of the two front runners.
History and rules are always written by winners.
Always. Well, anyways, folks, that is it for our presentation. We thank you very much for being with us. David, thank you so much. And I guess if there's one takeaway, is get out there and vote. Get out there and vote, folks.
Amen. And right.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, folks.
Bye-bye.
So long. Take care, David.
Take care.